In this video, I want to explain how to use your Chubby stove, which is what we've got right down here. This is, it looks like an antique stove. It's an old retro sort of style, but it's actually being manufactured today. They've been around for about 40 years, designed and manufactured by a man named Larry Trainer. And this is an anthracite stove. That's different than a wood stove. Anthracite is a hard, clean burning form of coal. Oh, when a lot of people think of coal, they think of dirty black smoke and stuff like that. Anthracite's not like that. There really is virtually no smoke, maybe a little bit at the beginning, and then that's it. You get long-lasting heat that's easy to maintain. It's much easier to live with an anthracite stove than it is a wood stove. So this video is all about how to use one of these because the process is very different than when you're using a wood stove. And the reason for that is because of anthracite itself. As I said, it's a form of coal. It's the hardest form of coal around. And in order for it to burn properly, two things have to be in place. First of all, the air needs to come up through the bottom. So there needs to be a grate that's got slots in it or some method for air to come up from the bottom. That's very key. And second of all, the stove needs to have a mechanism that shakes the burning coals so that the ash falls down. And the reason is because as anthracite burns, as the chunks of anthracite burn, it sloughs off ash. And if the ash were to build up sufficiently, it would plug up all the spaces between the burning coals and it would go out because it couldn't get to the air. So the ability to shake the grate is very important, to shake that fire. That's how you remove the ash. Unlike a wood stove, you really do not want to stir an anthracite fire because that's a great way of putting it out, believe it or not. And that's the real challenge with an anthracite fire. And I say challenge, it's not a big deal, but once you understand how it works, you can keep your anthracite fire burning. It won't go out. But if you don't do things correctly, the fire will go out. So this video is all about how to manage your Chubby stove properly so the fire burns consistently and evenly. And what you're going to notice is that the work involved is very, very minimal. That's why years ago, when anthracite was more popular, if people could afford the anthracite, they would always use it over wood. Wood heat's great. I heat with wood myself. I like wood heat. But I'm telling you, this anthracite fire is something to be seen. So let's go and take a closer look. I'll show you the parts of the stove and the controls. That's very important. And then we'll get into how to use them. So as I mentioned before, an anthracite stove is substantially different from a wood stove. And a big part of that difference is the controls. So first control, this is a turn damper. You might have this on a wood stove installation. When the handle is horizontal, that means there's a butterfly inside, a circular disc that's also horizontal. So right now it's closed, and you might be thinking, well, why would I want to close the stovepipe when the fire's burning? Well, the disc inside the pipe is not quite the same diameter as the stovepipe. So even fully closed, it's still kind of open a bit. And in fact, for many burning situations, you want it in what appears to be the fully closed position. But it can move. I mean, that's fully open. And I'm going to show you later under what circumstances you'd want it open. But most of the time you're going to run it closed or maybe a little bit open. Now this thing here requires some explanation too. You won't see this on a wood stove. You will see it on an oil furnace, for instance. And you do need one of these in a Chubby stove installation. This controls the draft. You see a calibrated draft control. And what this does is, if because of wind conditions outside, there's too much suction in the chimney, this will open to allow room air to go in and relieve that suction instead of too much suction on the anthracite fire. Now, why would you want to avoid too much suction on the anthracite fire? Well, that's because it's going to burn too hot. Essentially, the suction is going to make that fire burn much hotter than you probably want it to, and it might actually burn out sooner than you expect it to as well. So A barometric damper, that's what this is generically called, is required here. And there's a weight here. You can loosen that and move the weight closer in or further out before tightening it in order to get the right balance. You see, it's just barely balanced. So it's closed normally, but if we get a big gust of wind or something, it's just going to open up as needed. So pretty important. It's also important to note where this is. So it's above the turn damper. It's below the elbow that goes outside. So this is essentially a perfect installation for an anthracite stove, and quite different than a wood stove. Now down here, we've really got two chambers. The top chamber is where the anthracite is burning. It's not burning very high right now, but there is a fair amount of heat being given off. And that's where we put in the coal, as I'll show you later. Down here is where the ash goes when you've shaken it. There's a pan in there that you can pull out in order to get rid of the ash. Over here, we've got the control for shaking the grate. So this actually revolves the grate, moves it from side to shake that ash down. So during the servicing, which I'll show you later in the video, we're going to pull it all the way out and all the way in using our poker, because it's pretty warm, all the way out and all the way in 25 times. That's part of the process for shaking down the ash, and a very important part too. The vent here at the bottom, this is the air intake. You'll soon learn how to adjust these things based on your own experience, and it is a bit of an art form because it depends to a certain extent on the particular anthracite you're burning, the home you're in, how well it's insulated, how cold it is outside. All of these things need to be taken into consideration. Now there's one other thing I want to show you right now, and that's over here on the side. There is a thermometer. And that's very helpful because it can tell you how the stove is burning. Like right now, the temperature on the side here is just about 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a great temperature, in fact, for general purpose use. We don't want the stove to go too cool because then our anthracite fire might burn out. We don't want it to get too hot either. So this is a magnetic thing, and the proper location for it is right above this little thing here. That's a great spot. Just clips there, gives us a nice accurate reading. So just a few brief words now about the tools you need to service your Chubby. One is a poker. This is not to stir the fire. As I said before, if you stir an anthracite fire, even a strongly burning one, you can actually put it out. So this poker is actually for a process called flossing, which has to do with the ash shaking down process. I'm going to show you about that later in the video. This is an ice scoop. This one happens to be 58 ounces. It's a good size. I got this on Amazon. It's the ideal tool for getting scoops of anthracite when it comes time to load the stove. So the best thing I have found for storing anthracite in the house so it's ready to use is one of these metal tubs. It does a great job. It'll last forever, and it holds, in our case here, a number of days of coal. When this is full, this is going to keep our place warm for a number of days. And I forgot to mention before, but what's the advantage? Why would anyone want to burn anthracite? Well, if you're buying your heating fuel, then anthracite is usually the cheapest way to go if you don't have access to natural gas. We certainly don't here. So if you're out of the range of natural gas, you'd be hard pressed to heat your home for less money than you can with anthracite. So that's the main motivation, and the fact that the stove looks great. And it's wonderful to have a kind of a cheery glow as part of your life. So next, I want to show you how to light this stove, and as you'd guess, it's a completely different process than if you're starting a wood stove. Before I do, though, I just want to touch on a couple of important things that need to be in place. This is a single wall stovepipe, just the same kind you'd use for a wood stove. Works great. In fact, you'll find that the flue temperature from this stove is quite a bit lower than from a wood stove, so it's less hard on the stovepipe. But this stovepipe here, it needs to connect to some kind of an outside chimney. One option is an insulated stovepipe, just of the same kind you'd use with a wood stove installation. Another option is a masonry chimney. You can plug this stovepipe into a masonry chimney, as long as it's a modern sort that's got a proper clay liner inside. That's going to work fine. If you don't have, whatever you do, do not pipe this into just a single wall pipe outside, because in winter that pipe's going to get too cold. It's not going to have a sufficient draft. So you need either the insulated stovepipe or a proper masonry chimney. Now this particular model of Chubby is one of two kinds. This is meant for an installation right here, where the stovepipe is going to rise vertically and then go into the wall and some sort of external chimney outside. But you can also install one of these right in front of a fireplace. So that's a great thing, because fireplaces do not heat homes very well on their own. In fact, some fireplaces actually consume more heat. They take more heat out of your house than they actually provide because of the draft. But you can get a Chubby stove that works with a fireplace. Instead of having the outlet coming off the top here, it comes off the back. So it goes horizontally for a while and then into the fireplace. And it can work that way. So two different kinds. And with those two different kinds, you can get a version that has no blower fan or a blower fan. Now this particular one has a blower fan. I'm going to show you how that works. It actually makes a pretty big difference. I really like the blower because it gives you more control and more rapid heat transmission to the room as well. But for now, let's get started and light this thing. The first step I'm going to show you here, you may or may not have to do, and that's just warming the flue, warming the chimney and the stovepipe so that there's a good draw. If your stove is stone cold, it might take a little while for the smoke of the actual fire to start making its way out of the chimney. This is going to help ensure that that happens more or less right away. You can use newspaper, just any kind of light paper. See how that the smoke's being drawn up the chimney, and that flow of air up the chimney will continue for the few minutes that I need it to as I actually start the wood fire. Now I forgot to mention earlier that we need to open the turn damper to the fully open position, so the handle is vertical, and we need to fully open the air vents on the bottom. So this part of things is quite a bit like lighting a regular wood stove. You just put in some newspapers or some cardboard, thin pieces of wood. It's all chunks of hardwood here. Our objective is to make a nice bed of coals. So we need some small pieces to start, but we also need some larger ones. When this gets going, I think I'll put on some of these, and then we'll let it burn down to a nice bed of coals. When the wood fire looks like it's going reliably and steadily, as you can see here, you can shut the door. And like I said, we don't want to put anthracite on this. That won't really help, but we want to have a nice, rich, glowing bed of hardwood coals. And we're just going to wait for this to burn down. I'm going to add some more chunks as well. Might as well do one now. Maybe I might have to add some more later, but it all depends on the quality of coal bed that we create. So we'll come back in a couple minutes and take a look at that. So I am going to add a few more chunks of wood here while we're building up our coal bed. But it's a good time to mention that the Chubby can be used with wood if you want. You're not going to be able to, it won't hold a fire all night or anything like that on little chunks of wood like this, but for heating in the shoulder seasons, in the spring and fall, when maybe you only need a little fire to take the chill off and you really don't want a fire burning all the time, then this is the way you do it. Just chunks of wood you can throw in there and when you don't need a full-blown anthracite fire. So we'll just let that burn down to coals, and the next stage is adding that first thin layer of anthracite. Now, I said before that we want to have a bed of coals, but that can mean different things to different people. So let's come here and take a look. This is what a good bed of coals looks like. There's still some combustion going on, there's still some flames, so it's not a really low bed of coals, but this is what we want. And I'm going to put on about 1 inch of coal everywhere, so a fairly thin layer. And I'm not going to throw it in, I'm just going to kind of dump it in. The wood is going to get that anthracite going. And while that's happening, we're going to leave everything open. The bottom air intake and the turn damper. And I'm going to come back and look at it in about 5 or 10 minutes, see how it's doing. So we waited about 35 minutes for the hardwood to burn down to a kind of a coal bed. We added that thin layer of anthracite about 10 minutes ago. And this is what it looks like. That's a perfect situation for topping up the fire pot, which is this round container, with anthracite right to the top. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm level with the top of the fire pot now. I like to see those blue flames. That's always a good sign. It's going to work out just fine. Time to close the air intake, go into kind of a position like this, about 1/16 of an inch on this side, maybe 1/8 of an inch on that side, and turn the turn damper to the fully closed position. As I said before, it's not fully closed because the disc is smaller than the stovepipe, but that's the way we want this. And then, believe it or not, that is the last thing we need to do to this stove for the next 12 hours. It's just going to sit there and burn. If we want more heat than it's putting out, we can give it a little more air, open up the turn damper a bit. But that's it, steady state, even heat. No change in the output unless you want it. That's essentially what this is all about. After 12 hours, it will be time for servicing, which is what I'll show you next. So the Chubby has a full head of steam, so to speak. It's got anthracite in it, it's burning properly, it's giving off heat, and now I want to explain how you can vary that heat output depending on your situation and what the weather's doing and all that stuff. So that thermometer I told you about before, it's on the side here. That's kind of your first indication. You want the side temperature to be between 300 and 500 degrees. Here for this installation in this home, 350 to 400 is typical. You can go up to 500. There's no problem that way. But this stove is now in a steady state of combustion, and it can continue to give off this amount of heat for about 12 hours without doing anything to it. And the steady state we've reached right now is a function of two things. First of all, this is really the default position of the air intake. So if you remember, that's fully open. We don't actually run it that way. We only have it fully open when we're servicing the stove. This is more of a typical opening right here, maybe a little bit of an opening. The openings aren't balanced on this particular stove. It's a little bit more on one than the other, but let's say for a moment I wanted to give this some more heat. The room isn't warm enough. what am I going to do? Well, I might open it this much, and in lockstep with opening up the air intake, I'm going to open up the turn damper a little bit as well. So right now it's as closed as it can be, and I can open it up a little bit. That's going to work very well with the increased air intake. The most I'd ever want to open it up, I think, during use would be about 45 degrees or so. The thing to understand about anthracite is that it's very powerful. It's got a lot of heat in it. But besides being challenging to get going sometimes, it's also slower to increase in heat than, say, a wood stove, which you might be used to. So you need to take your time. You need to let that fire build up its heat fairly slowly. If you try to get it to build up heat too quickly, say by opening up the air too much, then there's a good chance that your fire is going to go out. It's kind of strange stuff. Lots of heat, tremendous run time on the burn, but then there's this tendency to go out, as I said. So that's a steady state adjustment, and we would only want to deviate from that in a big way if we were going to be servicing the stove. We can turn it down less than this, and we can get more heat out of it, but at no time during everyday use would you have that air vent open all the way. You don't want to give your anthracite fire that much air during a normal burning period. Well, you might remember earlier on I explained that there were two basic configurations of Chubby stove. There's the kind with the stovepipe coming off the top for this installation, and then there's the kind where it comes out horizontally from the back so it can go into a chimney. Well, for both of those models, there is a feature that you might want to consider. We really like it a lot here, and that's the blower fan. The blower fan is located at the back, and it forces air through the back of the stove and through the firebox with pipes that actually go right in where the fire is, here at the front. You can see them right here. So those passages go right in above the anthracite fire. The beauty of the blower is that it greatly increases the heating output from the stove. And not just the quantity of heat, so not just the area that it can heat, but also the speed with which it can warm up the room. It really moves a lot of heat. And it's very interesting to look at the thermometer that's on the side of this stove, because when you turn the blower fan on, and by the way, it doesn't have to be used. You can use it if you want. You can shut it off if you want. But as soon as you turn it on, you can actually see the temperature dropping. It's that effective a method of moving heat from inside the stove to outside the stove. Now, we happen to have a variable speed control here. That's our own idea. And it's nice to be able to throttle the fan back a little bit. So when you turn it on, you can as I said, you can immediately see the temperature dropping on the thermometer, and that's a reflection of more heat being moved from the stove to the room. So when it comes to servicing the Chubby stove, that's something that only has to happen twice a day, 12 hours apart, and the work only takes about 5 minutes. So you start by opening up the turn damper on the stovepipe, and then opening up the vent here at the bottom all the way. That gets air flowing, and it starts to let the fire rise. And that's a very important point, because the danger with an anthracite fire is that it's going to go out. Anthracite's actually fairly reluctant to burn. Once you get it burning, it's very powerful. There's a lot of heat in it, but you want to avoid having the fire go too low, because it might go out, especially when you're servicing. Because as I've said before, the thing about the anthracite fire is that ash builds up around the coals, and that ash needs to be shaken down so that it preserves and reestablishes the air spaces around the burning coals. If the ash builds up too much, the fire will become what's called ash bound, which means the air can't get to the burning coals and it'll go out. So what you want to check for is that the fire is burning hot enough before you start the shaking down and the servicing. Now, typically, that might require only a minute or two of burning with the turn damper open and the bottom air vent open. But just to be sure, before you actually start servicing, open up the door and take a peek. What you'll see in here is a fire that is sufficiently hot to withstand the shaking down and servicing process. So that's exactly what we want to see. And now the first step is to take out the ash pan. You'll need to be wearing insulated work gloves, or as I am, some oven mitts here, because the pan is fairly hot, even though the ash that's in it was shaken down the last servicing. It's very important that you pour the ash away from your house into a steel ash can of some kind for safety. Now we're coming to the operation called flossing. I'm using a poker here. This is the poker that came with the Chubby, and I'm working my way through the cracks in the grate. They're plugged up with ash at the bottom, and if I don't floss first before I shake down, as you'll see, then the ash isn't going to be able to come out as I shake down. So the first step is always to reach underneath and to floss, which means basically breaking through the ash layer that's there in the slots of the grate. And you can see that ash falling out, and you can see the result that it has too. And that's encouraging combustion. And well, here, this is a perfect example of just how hot and clean anthracite burns. In this case, without any fan blowing air on it or anything. This is just a natural draft, and we're getting this kind of heat. So all the slots need to be flossed, and then it's on to the shaking process. The handle on the right is what shakes down the grate, and I recommend you use the poker in the handle. It's not going to be crazy hot, but it's probably going to be too hot to hold with your bare hand, and the hole in the middle is meant for the poker. You can see how it's turning the whole fire pot arrangement here, and that is shaking down the ash, which can now fall right down into the ash pan because of the flossing that you did earlier. You'll need to work the handle back and forth 25 times for each servicing. So when you're done servicing, the coals should be glowing just like you see here. You'll also notice that the level of anthracite has dropped. It doesn't actually drop very much during the burning period, but it does after you've shaken it down. And now is the time to add some more anthracite to bring it up level with the top of that round fire pot. So you don't want to throw it in hard. You just want to place it in until it's level with the surface. You really do not have to worry about smothering the fire by putting this on. When the fire is strong underneath, you can't smother it this way. This is exactly how things work. And essentially, we got a fire pot full of anthracite, and we're now ready to roll for another 12 hours after we adjust the air intake and the turn damper back down to the operational levels. One thing I want to point out to you, and this highlights one of the differences between wood fire and anthracite. I serviced this stove 2 hours ago, which means knocking down the ash, opening up the passages for the air, reestablishing those passages, and then topping up the burn pot inside with anthracite, so it's level with the top. So 2 hours ago I did that. Does it look like it's doing very much? No, it doesn't. It is giving off a lot of heat, though. I can feel it. This thing is actually working properly. This, believe it or not, is what success looks like. That's an anthracite fire about 2 hours after servicing. There's some glowing coals down below. You might be able to see a flicker of a blue flame up top. But the thing is, you must not panic when you see this, because as I said, this is what success looks like. This is what a properly burning anthracite fire looks within a few hours of servicing. You might be thinking, oh my goodness, my fire is going out. Let me give it more air. You know, if you're used to burning wood in a wood stove, that's what you're going to think. But that would be a mistake, because if you gave it more air right now, too much of the coal would burn too quickly, and you'd be in grave danger of having that fire go out. So this is what success looks like, and you do not want to rush the anthracite fire along. It's giving off lots of heat, and it's going to give off even more heat later, but you can't expect a kind of a roaring thing to go on, because anthracite just doesn't burn like that. So no discussion of burning anthracite would be complete without talking about anthracite quality. And as you'd imagine, with the product that comes out of the ground, it's not all going to be exactly the same. The difference between higher quality anthracite and not so high quality comes down to two things. First of all, it's ash content. So the lower ash means that you've got less ash to shake out of that fire and less ash to remove with the pan, at least twice a day. Higher ash just means you might have to empty that pan more often. You might have to do servicing, say, 3 times a day instead of twice a day. Another difference between high and lower quality is heat output. Of course, the lower the ash, that means there's more stuff that can burn in the coal, and so you get a higher BTU output. We're burning Blashack coal from Pennsylvania. That's a top brand. Lehigh, that's another top brand of coal. If you're not sure of the quality that you're going to buy, don't go and buy a ton or two or whatever you're going to need for the season. Just buy 4, 5, 6 bags to give it a try. And that way, if you don't like it, you're not stuck with very much. You'll be through that in a number of days, and then you can try something else. But if you can get it, especially as a beginner, you will do yourself a favor in going with the higher quality stuff, because it's just easier to manage the stove with it. There are fewer things that can trip you up, cause a problem. You're less likely, for instance, to have your fire ash bound if you're using higher quality coal, because there's just less ash to plug up all those little spaces I was telling you about. Price, of course, enters into things too. That's a determination you're going to have to make locally. But just start small, buy half a dozen bags, try it out, and then work from there depending on your experience. So this is a bag of the stuff that we're going to burn in that stove. And I want you to notice, see the word here? Nut. Nut coal. The word nut in this case refers to the size. This is what nut coal looks like. A certain size of chunk. The word nut in the world of anthracite means something from one brand to the next. It's kind of industry-wide. There are other sizes too, like stove coal is a bigger chunk than this. Then there is lump coal, which is even bigger yet. And then there's something called rice coal, which is very fine, and it kind of looks like big grains of rice. That stuff is for anthracite stoves that are self-feeding with an auger, kind of like a pellet stove. But nut is what the Chubby was designed to use, and that's the size you should choose. So at this stage, I want to compare using a Chubby stove with an airtight wood stove a little bit more. The main thing to understand is that burning anthracite in a setup like this is a lot less work than burning wood. And I'm not talking about the cutting of the wood or anything like that, but just simply servicing this stove twice a day compared with keeping a wood-burning stove going for the same amount of time, you're going to spend less than 25% of the time managing your anthracite fire compared with your wood fire. And that does not include a very big difference, and that's the whole chimney thing. If you've got an airtight wood stove, you should be cleaning that thing multiple times each winter. And that means taking the stovepipe off, taking it outside, brushing it out, and then going and cleaning your chimney too. It's not unreasonable if you're heating in a serious way in a cold climate to have to do that every 2 weeks. Certainly you wouldn't want to let it go for more than a month. And the reason is because the buildup inside of a chimney from a wood fire, namely the creosote, is highly flammable. It takes a lot to get a creosote fire going, but if there's creosote inside your chimney and it catches fire, it's difficult to put out, and it's hot enough that it can damage a chimney to the point where it catches your house on fire. So chimney fires, that's why people clean their wood stove pipes so diligently, is to avoid the chimney fire. Believe it or not, you do not have to clean the chimney on the Chubby stove. That means you don't have to clean the stovepipe. You don't have to clean the chimney outside. In fact, I know a man who has been heating his house with a Chubby stove for 35 years, and he has never cleaned the chimney once. And he's inspected it. It's just not needed cleaning. In fact, he did tell me that recently he was up on the roof. He wanted to replace the chimney cap on his chimney, and he took the opportunity to look with a flashlight down the chimney. The part of the chimney he could see from the roof looked as clean as the day he installed that chimney when he built the house 35 years ago. So that is a huge savings right there. You're not on the roof. You're not hauling this sooty pipe outside to brush it out and end up looking like some sort of a chimney sweep or something like that. It's much cleaner, and it's not only a lot less work in the maintenance and the actual burning and the shaking down the ash compared with the wood stove, but you can forget about all need for cleaning that chimney. So let me show you something about this chimney and how clean this whole thing burns. This stove has been heating this house through a legendary Canadian winter. We're now in spring. It's heated the whole winter. We've put about 1.25 tons of coal through this, and the chimney has not been apart the whole time. You can see it just has a kind of a layer of powder on it. Fly ash, it's called. And it's been like this for quite a while. It built up to the extent that you see now quite quickly in the process, and it just doesn't get any worse than this. So the only exception might be your horizontal section here, because when you shake down the ash, there's dust, very fine fly ash that rises up because of the draft and goes horizontal, and in this case it then goes vertical again and up out of the chimney. Well, when that fly ash is traveling in the horizontal direction, some of it can settle out. So it's possible that you might have, after several years maybe, 1 inch or 2 of fly ash on the bottom of a horizontal section like this, which could reduce your draft somewhat. So maybe at the end of your first season, you might want to take this chimney off, take the stovepipe off, and just see where you're at. Chances are you won't have to do any cleaning. If you do have to clean the fly ash out once every season, once every 2 or 3 years, maybe even never, might be what you're up against. And the thing too is, the fly ash, which is the only stuff that comes in contact with the inside of a chimney that's burning anthracite, it's just dust. It's just powder. It's not flammable like the creosote buildup from a wood stove, which is highly flammable. So the worst thing that can happen if you're not cleaning enough is that you'll start to lose your draft, if and only if you have fly ash building up in your horizontal pipe, which is not a given. It's actually fairly rare, but I just want to mention it so that you know to keep your eye on it, at least as you get experience. There are many ways to heat your home, and as far as anthracite goes, we have found it to be economical, simple, not a lot of work, and just very comfortable. The stove you see here is in my son Robert's house. He's lived with this stove. I've seen it close up for an entire season now, and we're very impressed, and we certainly recommend this approach to heating if it makes sense for you. I hope you found this useful. Any questions or comments, you can just look up Chubby Stove and there'll be people there ready to help you. But enjoy a nice warm home.